All right, let's get your feedback this week on an issue that's divided politicians and sparked heavy debate in the community. And, of course, that's Ken Wyatt's plan to recognise Indigenous Australians in the Constitution. And perhaps more contentious than that constitutional change was his idea of this Indigenous voice to the Parliament. Indeed, with a real lack of clarity from the government here, what is even meant by the term Indigenous voice? Critics say it will be a third chamber of the Parliament and it will divide Australians by their race. Supporters say it's long overdue and that a treaty should also be on the table. Columnist and Sky News senior reporter Caroline Marcus joins me tonight to go through your feedback. Now, we reached out to the online community this week and posted a question to my Facebook page. The question was, if a referendum was held today on Indigenous recognition, would you support changing our Constitution? Caroline, we got a fair amount of feedback, didn't we?
You certainly did, Peter. There were more than 900 responses to this post, so it absolutely went off online, and I trawled through as many as I could. I could only find 6, though, that actually said that we should change the Constitution. Most people were, and overwhelmingly, said no, that they don't want to see any changes to a Constitution, and they thought that the idea of an Indigenous voice to Parliament was a very bad one and a very divisive one. And if I had to sort of sum up what people were saying as to why they were opposed to it, it was because they thought that all Australians, whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous, should be treated equally. There shouldn't be more rights given to one group over another. That there should be no sort of segregation enshrined into the Constitution, and that they didn't know as well exactly what a voice would entail and look like and what that would mean for them. So maybe we should go through a few of those comments, and we'll start with Sandy, who says, I do not support changing our Constitution, nor do I support a voice. We are one, we are many, and we are one country, equal human beings. Helena said something quite similar. If I had to vote today, my answer would be no, because I don't know the implications of amending the Constitution. I am Australian by birth, as were many generations of my ancestors. Australia has always been and always will be my home. I have just as much affinity to the land as any other person that loves this wonderful country. Any change to the Constitution should unite nor divide our people. And Helena adds as well that it's one thing to acknowledge the wrongdoings of the past and learn from them, but constantly looking back is pointless, and that the government should instead focus on programs for health, education, social issues and job opportunities, which was another common theme, Peter. People saying, how will having an Indigenous voice to Parliament, how will recognition in the Constitution actually change the lives of disadvantaged Indigenous people, especially living in remote communities? How will this symbolism actually close the gap?
Yeah, look, the vein that people have here in most of the comments that I read too was a lot of sympathy for the current predicament of Indigenous people, particularly women and children in remote communities. No one's saying that there doesn't need to be money spent. There's plenty of money spent, but that it's, you know, the question is how well it's spent, of course. But no one's denying that reality, but they're not buying this idea that you fix all problems by changing the Constitution. A couple of I want to point to was Gay in particular I thought was interesting. We'll put Gay up on the screen, but she says, I'm 67 and as a young girl I fought for Aboriginals to have equal rights, not more, equal, as we are all one nation, so I do not support changing our Constitution. I also want to put up Bill. I think Bill's comments were also very interesting. He said, I surprised myself with no on both. This is a question of constitutional change and the voice. I believe in equality. I think acknowledging the Indigenous people is appropriate, but I don't believe the current descendants can claim such exclusivity. I don't deny the injustices of the past, but I feel the way forward is inclusive and cohesive, not divisive. And interestingly enough, let's have a look at Frank in Victoria too. This goes to the idea of, you know, who really was first in any country and how far back do we go when we acknowledge wrongs of the past. Frank says the idea that one group arrived first and therefore have greater dominion than those who arrived later is an infantile concept. It's as silly as saying finders keepers. Were there any that surprised you, Caroline?
Oh, well, look, I guess it surprised me just how overwhelming the response was in favour of not changing the Constitution. Now, of course, those are viewers of the program. They might have certain political views. I've talked to some people on the streets as well about this issue this week, and they were divided as well. People were saying to me, look, we support the idea of Indigenous people being recognised, but we don't know what this will look like in practice. How will the Constitution be changed exactly? What does the voice look like? And others saying that, well, they don't see. I spoke to one Indigenous man who said, well, I don't see this ever happening, so it's not something that really concerns me at all. It wasn't something that took up his attention. But look, there was another interesting one from Mark in New South Wales, who starts off as if he does agree with this idea of changing it. He says, I fully support this idea. For too long, Indigenous people of this country have been called all sorts of things rather than what they are, Australians. But if that's what the government intends, then yes, I will fully support this, provided, of course, equal means equal to all. No more playing favourites because of race, creed or colour. Every person in the country treated equally on job applications, medical treatments, welfare, etc. No more because you are this, you're entitled to more. One country, one rule. So I think Mark being a little bit cheeky there, saying he doesn't think there should be any of this sort of positive discrimination that we see at the moment when it comes to perhaps certain jobs or certain welfare entitlements when it comes to Indigenous Australians. But it was interesting, Peter, to see some of the recent commentary about this. You pointed out in the headlines that the former High Court Chief Justice, Murray Gleeson, has come out today and he supported the idea of having a voice to Parliament. He said that this could be, rather than in the Constitution, it could be something that comes through legislation. He made the point that he thinks that a constitutionally enshrined voice would help atone for the dispossession of Aboriginal people, which was an interesting concept. I don't know how it repairs necessarily the mistakes that have happened in the past, and will this be the end of it, or will you know, what's next?
Well, it won't be the end, because you know that in the statement from the heart, the Uluru Statement, there was a lot of paper in that document spent talking about a treaty, negotiation of a treaty. Labor's Indigenous spokesman Linda Burney made it very clear this week too that if there was to be treaty negotiations, she said it must be multiple treaties because very different sort of skin group Indigenous communities would want treaties themselves with the government, that, you know, one Indigenous group could not speak for all Indigenous people, and I think she's right there. But that goes to the point of how divisive this, you know, quite literally dividing not just Australians, but dividing Indigenous Australians. And we know Queensland's putting its toe in the water. Not much is really known, but they're certainly going down the path of starting the ball rolling on treaty negotiations. Victoria is a little bit more advanced, and it's this sort of commentary that it's not just this, it's that. Once you get to here, it's this, and more and more and more. That means Australians are not working in a public policy sense to bring the country together. We're working to carve it up and divide it up. And it's not about atoning for the past, because there has been an enormous amount of reconciliation and positive change in the last 250 plus years. So that's the trouble. And if you know, going by my Facebook page and elsewhere, if people are so reluctant at the very start, yes, you have a pro campaign and you have a negative campaign on a referendum, it's a long, long way to go before any of this could ever get up.
Yeah, absolutely. And the history of referenda shows that it is unlikely to get up. Out of the past 44 referenda we've had in Australia, only 8 have had a positive result from it. Only 8 led to a yes vote. So the history is against this working, and if there's any sort of concern that it's going to divide people or create 2 classes of citizens, or potentially a 3rd chamber of parliament, I don't think people will go for it. So look, it remains to be seen exactly the detail of what they would put in a referendum, but at this stage I think there's a lot of opposition to the idea.
Yeah, look, I have to say before we go to a break, the idea that you know it wouldn't be supported by the Australian people, that it would fail at a referendum, the idea then that you just ram it through the parliament as legislation to set up the voice, a voice that you know people wouldn't vote for at a referendum, is very backward politics to me. And I think the danger here is that whilst people don't want it in the Constitution, the government may feel very compelled by the Indigenous lobby, might feel that perhaps it's promised a lot with Ken Wyatt, that it has to proceed down the legislative path. And, yes, there are a range of advisory bodies to federal governments, but very few of them legislated in this way. And, of course, we had ATSIC. I remember ATSIC well in the Howard years. When I worked in the Howard years, it was an absolutely patent, corrupt, terrible failure that was disbanded with the support of a lot of good Indigenous people, as well as a lot of people in government who are worried about probity. So, anyway, long way to go on all this, Caroline. Thank you for your hard work.